So in our last video, we noted that we currently grow enough food to feed 10 billion people annually. However, the human population is only 7.9 billion. So it sounds like we should have excess food. However, we know that there are over a billion people on the planet who are experiencing undernutrition and facing, and more than that, facing food insecurity in one form or another. So what's going on? And part of it has to do with the fact that of the habitable land on Earth, most of the Earth is covered in water, some of it is covered in glaciers, some of it is rocky and barren, some of it is desert, some of it is tundra. Of the habitable land on Earth, about half of it is converted over to farmland. A lot of the products that farmland is dedicated to, or that agricultural space is dedicated to, I should say, because it includes ranching territory as well. A lot of it is dedicated to high-impact products. For example, beef production. In an earlier unit, we talked about how much water is required in order to grow beef, how much land area is required per pound of beef compared to any of the other types of foods that we compared it to. You may recall that there were several different nutrients and other metrics that I compared it, and it was just the most resource-intensive food that we produce. Well, a lot of, say, rainforest is cleared in order to make space for beef ranching land or for agricultural space that grows feed for those cows. So there may be areas in less developed countries, and not just rainforest, but in other areas as well, in less developed countries where you have a population that is suffering food insecurity or undernutrition, and there's agricultural space available to grow products, to grow food. However, it's dedicated to other purposes. It's dedicated to growing feed for cattle. It's dedicated to raising cattle. Those cattle are not going to feed the people. They're going to be used, and the beef will be shipped as an export, perhaps to some highly developed country like the United States, the United Kingdom. It could go to China. It could go a lot of places. But the food that is grown in a location does not necessarily go to feed the people in that location, because it might be more economically beneficial to sell that product and get the money than it is to sell it food to the people there, because you might not have a lot of economic activity in the country itself. You need to get the money from outside sources. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that the money is going to go into the people. It's not going to necessarily go to the community around that local farm, because the farm itself could be owned by the state, it could be owned by a company in that country, or it could be owned by a multinational conglomerate company. Now, I singled out beef because it's a well-known resource-intensive that does not end up feeding a lot of people, and it creates a luxury item that is mostly enjoyed in highly developed countries. But there are other items as well. For example, palm oil plantations I mentioned, right? Clear large sections of rainforest in order to establish these monocultures of these palm oil trees. When we then cut down the fruits from them, extract the oil, that oil goes into cosmetics and detergents and snack food and all kinds of different products. It's a very, very cheap oil to produce, but most of those products end up being circulated around in more highly developed countries. Some products have to be grown in areas with certain climates, and so you get exotic fruits or certain types of vegetables, avocados, coffee beans. These are products that have to be grown in very particular type areas. Resource-intensive crops, generally enjoyed in more highly developed countries, have to be exported out and then imported into the United States, and you know that we love avocados and coffee over here. So part of the explanation is that, yes, we grow enough food to feed 10 billion people annually, but those resources are not evenly distributed. A lot of them go to support the lifestyles of people in the most highly developed countries. In addition, a report from the NRDC, the Natural Resource Defense Council, revealed that in the United States, somewhere up to about 40% of the food that is created never makes it to a plate. We grow apples on an orchard, we look at all these apples, and only the best looking apples ever actually make it to the grocery store. The ones that look a little deformed, or they look like their own color, or they have some sort of weird spot on the outside, they're frequently just left on the ground, or they're thrown away, taken to a dump. A lot of food at the grocery stores is never actually purchased, and that's just on the individual consumer end of things where we get our grocery stores. The same problem exists in much larger warehouses of food where sometimes stores of food just expire and never actually get utilized. Now, there are other reasons other than just the distribution and use of resources that cause food insecurity. For example, war. If you're in an area, if you live in a country that has been torn apart by war, fields have been bombed, right? The equipment has been destroyed. It's been, you can't go about your daily life in such a way that and pretend it's just safe and like everything is normal, because it's not, and it's dangerous. In such a situation, it's going to be hard to grow food, even if the soil is fertile, and even if the conditions are good. You may not be able to produce enough crops to support the population that you have in that location. You might even have money, and you would say, I'll buy imported crops, I'll get food from elsewhere. But the war may have destroyed bridges and train tracks and roads. The transportation is not possible, and people might just not be willing to risk going into certain types of areas. So it is not a coincidence that food insecurity is often high in areas where conflict is common. The climate could have an influence on food insecurity. You would have a very fertile area, right? You grow lots and lots of crops. Historically, you've grown tons of crops. You are an agricultural exporter. That's where your main source of income comes from. That's never been a concern before, but suddenly a drought comes along, and it's a 100-year drought. A drought like this should only come every 100 years, but you've had a drought like this every couple of years, right? They've just been happening more and more and more regularly, and they shouldn't be happening this regularly, but they've been happening back to back to back. And this is true, actually. This has been happening more and more regularly, where drought events or extreme weather events that should only happen every century or every 50 years, something like that, start happening every couple of years instead. I saw one documentary where they were talking to farmers in India, and they had been having these extremely long droughts for a very long time, very difficult to grow anything. And then they got all of the rain that they would normally get within a year, the entire year's worth of rain, in one night. And that amount of rain, that deluge, totally washed away all of their crops, their seeds, their soil, right? It just, giant wetland now. Crops ruined as a result of the climate. Level of industrialization, this has to do with infrastructure and access to technology. We talked about how much industrialized agriculture is able to increase the production of food in an earlier unit. We talked specifically about some of the environmental effects of concentrated animal feeding organizations and how big monocultures can decrease biodiversity, but the benefit of those is that they produce lots and lots and lots of food. So the more access you have to industrialized technology, the easier time you're going to have growing lots of food. If you are still utilizing manual labor, like just hand tools and maybe some farm animals to help you out, maybe just like a few members of your family to assist you, you're not going to be able to produce as much food as someone who has all of the latest farm equipment, big tractors, big wheat threshers, and that sort of thing. Also on this slide, we have poverty listed as something influencing food supply, which I feel like has been underlying all of this discussion, right? Obviously, if an economy has less money, they are less able to supply their populace with food. Not only that, but if you are impoverished, it might mean that you are forced to make choices which seem against your long-run best interests. So you might have some agricultural territory which could be used to grow food for your population, but you would get more money for the country if you used it instead for cash crops to be able to make sales. Being in a state of poverty means having to make that kind of decision. Frequently, a lack of money means a lack of options available to you. The human population is still growing. It's slowing down, but it's still growing. By 2050, we will likely need to feed about 9.7 billion people. about half of which will live in poverty. And that is because the locations where population growth is the fastest are the locations that are already facing food insecurity, the least developed countries. So the question becomes, how do we feed more people without seriously harming the environment? And I think at this point you guys can probably guess what my answer is going to be. It's focus on growing crops that are able to feed more people for the amount of space and resources required for them. More sustainable crops. That won't solve all the problems, but it at least will be a piece of the puzzle. All right, at the top of the slide, we have mild food insecurity, moderate food insecurity, and severe food insecurity. 3 different ratings of food insecurity. So what exactly is food insecurity, right? Like what's our definition here? Mild food insecurity means you're worried about the ability to obtain food. You're eating, right? You're getting your food, but you're not entirely confident about your ability long term to continue feeding yourself. Maybe you're living paycheck to paycheck. Maybe you see your savings account kind of dwindling, and you're making considerations about the food budget. At this point, you're worried about your sustained ability to continue buying food. Moderate food insecurity is the point at which you've started compromising the quality and variety of food severely. Obviously, I think all of us have looked at a grocery bill and said, "Oh, I spent a lot of money on that product last month. Maybe I should cut back on that." But severely compromising on quality and variety of food. So eating food that is expired is compromising on the quality of food. Compromising on the variety might mean that you are going specifically for the cheapest meals every single time, and it's probably from a very narrow category of cheapest meals, so it might just be a particular kind of pasta every single time. That's all you're really getting from the grocery store. College students know the ramen problem, I think, fairly well. So that is compromising on the quality and variety of food because you don't have the capacity to get any other kind of food. That's moderate food insecurity. Reducing quantities and skipping meals. Obviously not as a dieting trick of any kind, but because you are trying to make your budget last longer. So you are just reducing the amount you eat. Now we are entering the far end of moderate food insecurity. And severe food insecurity means you are experiencing hunger on a regular basis. You may be going days without eating, right? You are constantly thinking about food because you don't know where your next meal is necessarily going to come from. That is severe food insecurity. If you notice that any of these criteria sound familiar, that sounds like something you have experienced at some point in your life, I wouldn't be shocked about that, because food insecurity is a lot more common than we make it seem like it is. Now, if you experience food insecurity for a long enough period of time, you are at risk of having malnutrition, which actually comes in 2 different categories here. So the term malnutrition is a broad term which could apply to either overnutrition or undernutrition. Typically, we mean undernutrition when we say malnutrition. Undernutrition means inadequate ingestion of nutrients and calories, malabsorption, which means that your body has an impaired ability to get the vitamins and minerals out of the food that you're eating, and impaired metabolism. Your metabolism relies on the nutrients from your food to be able to function properly. So without them, it's going to start shutting down certain processes, or they're just going to be slowed down in some capacity. This can lead to anemia and blindness and thyroid damage from the lack of iron in your blood and vitamin A and iodine, respectively. In less developed countries, diets center on high carbohydrate grains with very little protein. So rice is a staple crop in a lot of less developed countries, with very little consumption of meat or any other protein source, and also a lack of fresh green leafy vegetables or fruits, which would be where you're getting a lot of your vitamins and minerals from. So they're getting enough calories to stay alive, but not enough of these vital nutrients. In highly developed countries, we also have problems of undernutrition and food insecurity, but we additionally have very frequently overnutrition issues, which is also unhealthy, resulting from diets rich in high fat and sugar and salt. This is correlated with high blood pressure, increased risk of heart attack, heart disease, risk of diabetes, all of these kind of issues. Just how we talked about the issues of poverty and transportation issues and getting food to locations that need them in less developed countries, a similar kind of problem actually exists in some locations in the United States. You get what are called food deserts, where there's lots of ample access to high-calorie snack foods and highly processed foods, things that contain a lot of sugar and salt and fat and things like that, high-carbohydrate type foods. But in terms of being able to get access to green leafy vegetables and fruits and the same kind of things we're talking about them not having access to in some of the less developed countries, it's a similar problem. Or you have access to them and they are much more expensive. And that therefore incentivizes concentrating your diet on the snack foods instead, because if you are dealing with some sort of budget, you might actually be able to buy more unhealthy food than you are healthy food. That's not true everywhere in the United States, but definitely is true in some locations. So food insecurity exists in every country, but resource consumption in general is highest in highly developed countries. Population growth, on the other hand, is generally concentrated to less developed countries. So let's take a look at that. The human population is not evenly distributed across the planet, and it is growing 14 times faster in less developed countries than it is in highly developed countries or developed countries. Increasingly, people in developed countries are moving to urban areas. So we have a couple of effects going on. Globally, we are getting more and more concentrations of people in less developed countries, but also the population is becoming more and more urbanized as we go, meaning that they're moving towards cities or suburban areas directly around cities, away from rural areas. This map shows population density since 1985, and it's growing over time, and you can see where it's becoming very, very red is some of the countries in the Middle East, some of the countries in Asia. It looks like here around New Zealand we have some population density increase. Got a couple countries in Africa. India in particular, you can see, turns this nice bright cherry red, and China as well. India and China are the two countries on Earth with the largest total populations, with India's growing more rapidly. Now, why isn't the population growth rate the same everywhere? If you think back to what we were talking about earlier with the human population growth curve, the reason why the human population exploded was that our birth rate remained pretty much the same, and we had all of these different ways that we decreased the death rate, and that increased our overall carrying capacity. So we raised the number of humans that Earth can support. Now, the mortality rate dropped globally. It dropped more in some places than others, but the mortality rate dropped globally. So if the population growth rate is relatively small in some of these other countries, that must mean that their birth rates dropped as well. To the point where if you're at zero population growth, which some European countries are, that means that your birth rate exactly matches the death rate. For every new person that's born, one person dies in your population, so year to year to year you have the exact same population. The United States has a slightly higher birth rate than it does death rate, so we are growing, but very slowly over time. Whereas in some of the less developed countries, their birth rate remains high compared to the much lower death rate. So now the question becomes, why is the birth rate higher in many less developed countries than it is in developed countries? And the answer comes down to economics again. Children in highly developed countries frequently represent an economic burden. You have to pay for a lot of things. You got to pay for daycare. You got to pay for clothes. You got to pay for food. You got to pay for their school supplies. You got to pay for them to go to college. It's spending money. And you get stuff out of it. You get joy. You get to see your legacy continued. You get to share your knowledge, your collected series of experiences with another human being who can then take the memory of you talking about those with them on into the future, even after you pass on, giving you a taste of immortality. There are good reasons to have a kid, but strictly from a cost-benefit analysis perspective, children cost a lot of money. If, however, you live in a more agrarian economy, a farm-based economy where more or less every family is working some sort of farm, and your economic production is based on what you can do with your hands, what you can produce with your own two hands. Every new child that is added to that family is not just another mouth to feed. They are another pair of hands in order to increase the overall production of that family. They're going to increase the amount of economic activity of your family unit, which means in that context, children are very economically valuable. They're there to help. On top of that, in less developed countries, the costs of raising children, of feeding them, of clothing them, of educating them, it's going to be substantially lower. So I offer you this explanation for why birth rates are higher in less developed countries than they are in highly developed countries. If children represent a money sink, you are economically incentivized to only have one or two children. Maybe if you really want a big family and you can afford it, you'll have a few more, but you're going to have a relatively small family on average. However, if children are economically valuable, if having more children effectively means making more money in the future, you are economically incentivized to have more children. So your family unit might have 4 children, 5 children, 6 children. You might increase the size of your family unit as a result. I am not suggesting that any family, any man and wife are sitting down with a calculator and a bunch of graph paper, and they're calculating exactly how much more money another child would be worth minus the cost of upkeep, and that's how they're deciding whether or not they're going to have another kid. I am simply suggesting that the size of the average family unit in a location may reflect these factors, but it will also be influenced by other types of considerations. So, several factors that affect the birth rate. Children as part of the labor force, what is their overall economic value, and the cost of raising and educating the children. And if fewer children are needed to support seniors, is your population aging? Are a lot of people living to an old retirement age and need long-term care? It might be very important then to have a large number of children so that when you are older, you have someone to take care of you. Multi-generational homes are a lot more common in less developed countries. Not that they're totally uncommon in highly developed countries either. Access to family planning in urban areas. Family planning is access to contraception and abortion rights. So being able to make plans regarding the size of your family, that is going to be a big determining factor in birth rates. Access to education and employment. Having a large family with lots of kids that each help raise each other, right? So every kid actually takes less work to raise because you have some of the older siblings to assist in the process. It might not be necessary if you have a job that requires you to go elsewhere for work where your children actually can't help you out. So depending on access to education and different employment opportunities, that might increase or decrease the cultural importance of having lots of kids. Age of reproduction is also a factor. In cultures where people are getting married and having families younger in life, they tend to produce more children. They tend to have more kids. Whereas if you get married and have kids later in life, then you are going to have fewer children on average. So here it cites women over 25 tend to have fewer children. Another factor will be whether you live in an urban environment or a rural environment, which all of these other factors will also tie into as well. Okay, next slide has some vocabulary terms on it. These are from your learning objectives. Rate of natural increase. This is the birth rate minus the death rate. So let's say the birth rate is 1,000 births per year and the death rate is 800 deaths per year. The rate of natural increase would be 200 per year. That is to say that each year the population is increasing at about 200 individuals. Now, the population may actually be increasing faster and faster and faster, or it may be increasing more and more slowly over time. So this is a crude number. The total fertility rate is the average number of children born to women in a population during their reproductive years. So if an average woman in a given population has one child, then the total fertility rate would be 1, and that would incorporate that some percentage of the population will have 3 children, some percent of the population will have 2 children, some will have 1, and some will have 0. But if you add them all up together and divide by the total, it might turn out that the average is about 1. So that's the total fertility rate, TFR, the average number of children born to women in a population during the reproductive years. You'll notice that a lot of the statistics in demography that have to do with birth rates are also concerned with the number of women in a population. For example, this chart up at the top shows the number of births in less developed countries, developing countries, and more developed countries per 1,000 women, showing that least developed countries have the highest number of births per 1,000 women. But it's not per 1,000 people in the population. And the reason is that the maximum rate of population increase is limited by how many women there are in the population, simply because they can only experience one pregnancy at a time, and the numbers just don't have that relationship with the number of men in a population. So it frequently makes more sense to look at these numbers in context of per 1,000 women in a population, and that's why it looks like this. Last vocabulary term on this slide, replacement level fertility. So we're going to combine the terms above. The replacement level fertility is the total fertility rate at which a population exactly replaces itself each generation. That is, the rate of natural increase is 0. So, if the average number of children born to women in a population during their reproductive years is 1, and at that total fertility rate you get an annual birth rate of about 1,000 births per year, and the annual mortality rate, the rate at which individuals in your population die, is also about 1,000 deaths per year, then that is replacement level fertility. The total fertility rate of 1 gets you a rate of natural increase which exactly matches the death rate of the population, so overall population growth would be 0. It should be noted that there are other reasons why a population might increase or decrease very suddenly other than birth and death rate, for example, immigration and emigration. So because individuals are seeking jobs or economic improvement, because they're fleeing religious persecution or ethnic conflicts or any other kind of war, or because they are environmental refugees, leaving famine and drought or other environmental degradation, they might leave their current location and seek refuge in another location. So that would decrease the population in one area and increase it in another area. As more and more locations are becoming environmentally damaged, deserts are getting bigger, island communities actually are being evacuated in some areas. They've closed up shop from some of these island villages and they've moved inland because the high tide is coming up high enough to completely flood the village, which it's been there for a very, very long time, but now the tides are coming up high enough to flood the village. You're getting more and more of these environmental refugees as Sudden torrential downpours are destroying crops that we've never seen rains like this before, or droughts that have gone on for entirely too long. We can't grow any food. We need to go and seek other kinds of food, or overuse of water resources. Right? We need to go elsewhere looking for water, and this is what we call environmental refugees. The U.S. Department of Defense recognized that all of this environmental damage was occurring, and that it was creating all of these climate refugees, and that there was going to be increased conflict and competition for resources in some areas, and they declared climate change to be a national security threat in addition to being an environmental threat, all these issues. We'll talk about that specifically a little bit later on, but the effects of climate change mean that some of these areas that already have the harshest conditions that you could imagine are getting harsher. So it's getting even harder for the people that live there.